Love-based leadership for me, it emerged organically because as I became an entrepreneur and I started to learn about, professional culture, for me grew out of an attempt to try to create the culture in an organization that I would even want to be a part of.
I hope you're open for a little bit of reverse interviewing here. It's going to be super fun.
Michael Watkins is back. The leadership transitions expert will dive into Jeff's love-based leadership concept, sharing powerful tools to transform your business.
This is a type of organization where it's going to live or die to a degree on the quality of the people, making sure people are value aligned, testing for emotional intelligence, because you can't be compassionate if you don't have that. How do you find people who have a growth mindset? To me, it's not, would this type of organization succeed? I think absolutely it would succeed. I think it's, how do you...
Welcome to another episode of Unlock Your Potential. Jeff Lerner, your host. Always so excited to be back with you, having amazing conversations with amazing humans, and in some cases, continuing amazing conversations with amazing humans, which is the case here. Michael Watkins is back for a part two. It's probably bad host form to ever suggest that the audience should discontinue listening and go listen to something else, but I will say, if you're here and you didn't catch part one, either before or after you listen to this part two, you might want to catch up on that, because we had a really great conversation and it felt like we left a lot undiscussed and decided to reconvene. That was, I'm guessing, maybe about 6-8 weeks ago. And I won't repeat all of Michael's biographical notes since he's been well introduced on the show, but I will simply say, if you didn't catch that episode, that he is a globally recognized leadership transitions expert. I was first introduced to him via his book, The First 90 Days, which is kind of the Bible for new executives or executives moving into new roles that want to get up to speed quickly. And he has another book now that was more recently published called The 6 Disciplines to Strategic Thinking, which I actually want to dig into more here on this episode. Lives in Zurich and currently at IMD, formerly at INSEAD. We gave him a hard time because he's an alumni of Harvard and he's very distinguished.
Yeah.
But Michael, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm just delighted to be back and really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you getting back here. So I feel like we should try to pick up roughly where we left off in our last conversation, which was we had just started to scratch the surface on this love-based leadership concept, which my audience has some familiarity with because they know that it's something that my wife and I, it's sort of a staple of our evangelism and the work that we do. But I would really love to almost like pressure cook it with you and really get into the nitty-gritty of trying to bring this theory to life through your lens, because frankly, you work, like I have a vision of taking this concept of love-based leadership and using it to permeate, much, let's call them large organizations, or the kind of organizations where you really can start to affect like civilization level change if you can get big companies changing the way they do. Most of our work in love-based leadership is at the smaller sort of solopreneur or local entrepreneur level. So I'd really love to see what it looks like to try to scale this idea. As a refresher for yourself and the audience, I mean, the concept of love-based leadership for us emerged as sort of a hypothetical where we took the concept of nonviolent communication, which is a pretty well-established concept in interpersonal relationships, that's basically learning how to communicate in a way that strips all the power dynamics out of what's naturally embedded in language, where because of the roles we inhabit, there's this sort of natural hierarchical orientation in relationships where, whether it's husband and wife or father and child or, whatever, there's just these natural, like, authoritative positions in regards to certain aspects of life. And the idea of nonviolent communication is you strip all that vertical power dynamic out of language, and it's always a level field in the way you communicate anything. There's no assumed supremacy or authority. And then we said, like, what would it look like? And by the way, I mean, that's like incredible medicine for a marriage, let's say. But what does it look like when you try to take that and install it in professional organizations, which are by their very nature hierarchical, because people have to answer to and report to others, and decisions have to get made and disseminated vertically. And it's like you're never going to dismantle the overall power dynamic in an organization, but how can you at least get everybody enrolled in communicating as if it's not there? Because that changes everyone's experience of doing the work together. So that was the hypothesis, and we've fleshed it out and sort of, operationalized it, like I said, for entrepreneurs that are starting organizations that want to create really attractive cultures to draw people into. But frankly, we've never had an opportunity to go into a big organization and say, like, what would it look like to try to adopt this? So maybe we could start there. And I don't have like a prepared question, but I mean, even just based on what I've just presented to you, maybe you want to take it and run with it.
So I hope you're open for a little bit of reverse interviewing here.
Please. I'm
it's going to be super fun. It's going to be super fun for me to do that, right? So I did a little bit of research in advance about this, right? And so here's my understanding of what love-based leadership essentially is, and I want you just to react to what I'm going to say and tell me if I've got it roughly right? And then I think there's some interesting questions to get into. One of which is, can you make this happen in large or highly competitive or high stress companies or industries, right? That's one core question. There's others I think that we hopefully can explore, right? But to me, the approach you're describing, as I understand it, it's empathy, but more than empathy, compassion, genuine caring, right, for people in the organization. It's about building strong relationships and fostering trust. It's about prioritizing well-being, maybe encouraging collaboration. And I think the connection to nonviolent communication is super interesting, right? Because I think that there's a whole piece about how does one have open communication in the context of organizations, right? And we know that's not easy, right? And so, you're drawing at least somewhat, I think, on Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communications work, which is super interesting. Am I in the ballpark, Jeff, with the concept?
Yeah. Yes, I think you're probably on the pitcher's mound in the ballpark. I mean, it's right where I'd say we are. And I guess maybe a little bit of helpful context. So, and a little bit of my story from our previous conversation. Like, I was a high school dropout who decided to become a jazz musician because I was always a lot more interested in expression and joy and, call it novelty to some degree versus improvisation. Yeah, as sort of nonlinear living, versus chasing money and chasing esteem and the things that I was told were important when I was a kid. And so love-based leadership for me, it emerged organically because as I became an entrepreneur and I started to learn about, professional culture, it essentially, for me, grew out of an attempt to try to create the culture in an organization that I would even want to be a part of. Having realized that being a jazz musician was going to be a very poor, very hard life, I accepted that I was going to need to learn, to deal with the world of business, but I was sort of intent on fashioning it in my own image, if you will. And that's where it came about. So I will say I have what I believe is a fairly successful case study in love-based leadership, but it's only in the case where I'm the CEO and the founder and I get to kind of call those shots.
Yep.
But that's as far as it's gone.
No, but so I think it would be interesting to understand what this is juxtaposed against, Jeff, right? Because I mean, what you're describing is that it was in part shaped by reactions to things about the way organizations work that you don't like, right? And I guess I would say even more than that, you believe deeply, and I can see that don't really serve anybody other than maybe a few people who are doing it. And can you say a bit about that, about kind of the experience of, what it is that generated the desire to do it? Yeah,
and I don't think I had recognized the need to sort of formalize it and make it into a methodology with, at least conceptual policies and procedures and standardized ways of doing things. I just was maybe a little naive and thought like, well, I'll just be a really kind, warm, open humanistic person, and everybody will just align with that, right? And what I found is, and it was largely through scaling an organization, the business I have right now, which I've subsequently reversed what I'm about to describe by kind of tearing it back down to the studs. But at one point, we went through a massive hypergrowth phase where in about 2 years, we went from a team of 20 to a team of 200.
Wow.
And we, in that rapid scaling, obviously, the culture got diluted or diffused into basically being this sort of de facto aggregate of all the people we hired rapidly over a period of time. Like when you scale that fast, it's pretty hard to keep the guardrails on your culture because you're just growing so fast. And 2 years later, our culture was just essentially the average of everybody that we hired and all the baggage that they brought with them from their previous experience and their previous employers. And honestly, it was really toxic and it was kind of icky and it was just not what I wanted at all. And now technically I wasn't the CEO during that growth period, so I can't say that it wouldn't have maybe been different or better if I'd been there kind of holding guard the whole time. But my subsequent 2 years, when it got to that, when it kind of got to like peak toxicity and peak disappointment, I insisted I want to come back in as CEO. And over the last 2 years, I've been trying to, ex post facto transform the culture. And honestly, what I've ended up having to do, and it's not just for cultural reasons, it was, there was a business utility to this as well. But I basically fired 3/4 of the company. And
Not surprised.
yeah, now it's small and now it's everything I want it to be. It's highly love-based and it feels amazing. And I think now we're going to regrow more responsibly and I'm steering it. But that was my experience, is that we brought in a lot of people that had residue from where they came from. And so that's my experience of other companies. I've never worked anywhere else. I was a musician before I was an entrepreneur. And the only time I ever had a job at anybody else's business was when I was 16 years old for a summer and I got fired because I hated the culture and I didn't fit. But so I've resisted it ever since. But in the meantime, I've experienced indirectly or vicariously other cultures through all these other people that came in that have so much baggage, so much scar tissue, so many what I consider to be dysfunctional interpersonal habits in the way that they communicate in the doing of the work.
Absolutely.
And so I'm probably overly cynical about what else is out there because that's my...
No, but it's so interesting, Jeff, right? Because I think that there's a core piece of this, which is that I think in order to make this work, you need to have the right people, right? If you don't have the right people, it's not going to work, right? If you've got people with that scar tissue, if you've got people that don't have a growth mindset, if you have people that aren't capable of compassion, it's going to be super hard to make what you're describing work. And unfortunately, I found it only takes one person at senior levels to more or less completely blank an organization, right? I mean, it's astounding to me, and I've seen many examples of it, sadly, where the wrong person at the top, brought in can just utterly demolish an organization. So I think there's got to be something about some real precision and real rigor around who you hire and bring into the organization, right? And it sounds like that's what you did, right? What you did was a windowing of a form, right? You said, okay, look, I've got this set of principles about the kind of people I need to have in the org. And I'm going to winnow out the people that don't do that. I'm going to keep the people that are, and I'm going to continue to hire people that are capable, right? It's almost like you need to be capable of engaging in a culture that is love-based, right? Does that make sense to you?
I totally agree. There's people that, I think theoretically, like it's a human, I actually think being love-based is a form of authentic humanness. So I actually think everybody is sort of innately capable of it, but as a practical business question, can I tolerate or am I willing to make the investment necessary to get this person from traumatized to healed? Or do I need to just go find somebody else? Because I can't, I'm running a business here.
Yeah. No, and you just raised authenticity, which I think is actually super interesting too. Because I mean, so understanding what love-based leadership is a reaction to, I think is really powerful, right? And it begins to get you at some of the necessary conditions to make it work. And I think what I'm taking away from this so far is it's not so much size, as character and quality of people in the org, right? I mean, and as long as you can scale character and quality of people in the org, which I think is not easy, you should be able to scale this approach to doing things. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so I think there's two factors that are relevant here. One is, you mentioned, it's kind of like the bad apple theorem that, it only takes one to undo what everyone else has done, so to speak. It's kind of like, Warren Buffett said about reputation, right? Is a million consistent decisions create a reputation, one inconsistent decision destroys it. So is with people, right? You can have 200 amazingly aligned people and one person comes. In fact, you know what it all is? And I've actually learned this about life. It's all the prisoner's dilemma.
Interesting. Say more. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course. Right? So, if two people can trust each other under pressure, they can both make it out. But if either one person falters, they both lose. Right? And there's a lot of dynamics in life. You think of a SEAL team, world class. They call them the teams for a reason. It's all about the team, but there only needs to be one weak link in the chain. And so for me, this was my experience at Entra, was coming back as I did with a team of roughly 200 people and trying to install love-based leadership. The vast majority of people were aligned conceptually and willing to do the work or go through the process of aligning operationally and kind of unlearning and learning new things and unlearning old things. But it only took one or two people that, not even overtly, just sort of unspokenly over time, it became obvious they weren't willing to play along, that the whole thing was sort of untenable. And so, and again, it's like the prisoner's dilemma, right? Only across 200, not just with two. And so I think that's one really important thing to call out. The other is just sort of like you talk about this quality, this character. It's like sort of the what I would call the opposite of, or the alternative to love-based leadership is let's call it just command and control style leadership, right? It's like top down.
I was going to say it's not hate-based leadership, that's for sure, right? But it's
and to me that's
power-based leadership is what it is.
Around lowest common denominator. It's like, hey, we have to have a leadership style that can account for the widest variety of people, in just the fact that the workforce is made up of everyone. And so what's the lowest common denominator form of leadership that we'll all settle for, that's really about risk mitigation? It's minimizing the damage that one person can do as opposed to maximizing the greatness of every person involved. And you're right at the level of hiring. And so I would say my experience, and this is maybe what I'm trying to solve for, is my one experience of installing love-based leadership after an organization had already grown to a certain size was basically that it required purging out of the organization all the people, all the resources that weren't aligned. And, I've been doing that for the last 2 years now. On a 50-year time horizon, I know that, time will smile on this process, and that, 10, 20, 40 years from now, the enterprise value and the impact of the organization and the quality for those that were a part of it all will reflect that this was the right thing to do. And in fact, it was a highly sane thing to do from a business perspective. Even if it was only at the level of enterprise value, we'll have a lot more of it because we went through this. But that's only when you think in terms of the long game. I can only imagine going into an organization that operates on like a quarterly, earnings report cycle and has a board to answer to, going, no, you're going to need to spend the next year purging out all the people in this organization that are not willing to be love-based. And then probably another year after that, resetting those that are still here. And then maybe in years 3 and beyond, you're going to start to capture exponential dividends for having done this work. That would all be true, and it would probably all be rejected.
I think there's a really important truth, though, first, that I think is important to acknowledge, Jeff, which is, I think if you can successfully do this, you will create sustainable value, right? You will. because the very character of the org and the people in it is going to be highly responsive to customers, highly customer centric, right? It's going to be creative in a really powerful sense, right? And so to me, it's not, would this, type of organization succeed? I think absolutely it would succeed. I think it's, how do you get, and I think it's probably easier if you're starting and growing something to begin with the kernel that you're starting with, and harder to take something that's existing and rework it into this, I think, right? I think that's true. So that's one thought. The other thought is I always like to think about what are the absolutely centrally important core processes and capabilities of organizations, right? And I think we've come up with one already, which is the hiring process, right? I mean, most organizations, I think they think their hiring processes are important. They want to hire good people, sure. But this is a situation where this is a type of organization where, it's going to live or die to a degree on the quality of the people that you have, right? And so what that means is you're going to spend a huge amount of attention to the recruiting and onboarding and integration process, right, to keep this going. And so it's going to be things like, making sure people are value aligned. Yeah. It's going to be things like testing for emotional intelligence, because you can't be compassionate if you don't have that. It's, how do you find people who have a growth mindset, right? How do you discern people who have a growth mindset, who are collaborative, and then I think it's the process of, what sort of assessment do you do, right, to identify those people and really make sure with high confidence, right, that you're getting them. And then what does it mean? Me, I'm very interested in the first 90 days, obviously, right? And so that flows automatically into onboarding. But I always say, look, it's not, onboarding is great, and don't get me wrong, you want to do it, but you also need to truly integrate people into the organization, right? And so what does it mean in the context of a love-based organization to onboard and integrate people, right? And I think that means a kind of embrace of people and an application of the similar sort of principles to how you bring somebody into an organization. And then, does that make sense, right? Because what I'm looking for is what are some of the absolute foundational things that have to be true to make this work?
Yeah, it totally is. And it's interesting, again, and I mean, people that work at Entra, which again, we've taught love-based leadership. At Entra, we have a lot of people that are like ground level entrepreneurs. And so we teach it to them and say, you'll have this wonderful, rewarding experience if you can grow an organization this way from the beginning, to your point. And that's certainly the easiest way to do it. And we have a lot of people that have come out of our programs that have built love-based let's call them, love-based leadership-based organizations at maybe the level of, a 2-person team or a 5-person team or a 10-person team. We're just the biggest one I know of that's done it at the level of 200, although we're smaller now, post-purge. But it is really interesting because, that's when I look at our organization and who the people that are here post-purge, and it is a really beautiful group of humans. But there's a couple things that I'll say with that is I'd say there's 2 key traits that have to be mastered in order to be a person where the love-based nature of the leadership dynamic doesn't turn into a liability because of like what a reckless person can get away with, right? One of those is the ability to be simultaneously like vulnerable and very human, to have your humanity openly on display within the org, but at the same time, sort of almost a stoicism about, but I'm still going to show up and get the work done.
And a confidence, and I mean the term I've sometimes heard for this is robust vulnerability, right? It's not. Okay. It sounds like a oxymoron, right? But it's it's vulnerability that is rooted in confidence, right?
Yeah, and like Brene Brown has the whole power of vulnerability concept, and it's deep. I mean, I think we can see how that's deeply true at an individual level, but within a business, that there are certain stakeholders that are just so empirically particularly if you're in an organization that has, investors or shareholders or a board, the vulnerability is not part of they don't see power in organizational vulnerability. They see liability. And so I can imagine that would be, we have the benefit of being a closely held private, I'm the only owner now after some of the changes. So I see that as one of the issues, but also I'll tell you another thing that we've really found as an issue is people thinking that because things feel love-based, that means that they're permissive. And that, if I don't do a good job, my boss has to be love-based. And so he'll gently, cajole me instead of sternly reprimanding me or outright firing me. And we sometimes shock people that we still have really high standards. And they're like, but I thought you were love-based. And we're like, yeah, we're very love-based. So like,
I'm going to make a joke. I'm going to make a joke, but you're a tough love-based organization. I'm kidding you, right? But I think it's so interesting, Jeff, because I like you, I'm a co-owner of a small leadership development company. We've got, I think, 6-7 employees and a network of maybe 70, 80 coaches who are contractors, basically. But we go a long way down the road of being a love-based organization, right? Just based on this conversation, which I think is kind of fascinating. And I mean, I think it does flow from the leadership, right? Both the CEO and I deeply care about our people, and we try to create a culture that has many of the attributes that you're describing, right? But I think you just said, but you're kind of encouraging me to think about my own reality, right? And how do we create this little jewel? Because I think it is a little jewel. But also the challenges of sustaining it, right? And again, I think being privately held helps for sure. Mm-hmm. But it also is bringing back the conversation about the sort of the what must be true to make this work kind of conversation. I mean, the human capital, the people, how you hire and onboard them. I think there's a whole thing there about how do you balance the real need for coordination and control with love-based leadership, right? How do you do that exactly, right? And I think, again, you can imagine that things that would help would be things like collaborative goal setting, right? You need clear expectations. You want accountability, but accountability that's based in trust, right? But also in rigor. Empowering delegation, right? Transparency. We could keep going on, right? But it feels like you need to have some, again, rigor in how you reconcile the need for coordination and control, because it's true and it's unavoidable with the love-based principle. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And I'll share with you sort of philosophically how I think we attempt to at least, how would I term this? How to sort of institutionalize the rigor at its foundation rather than having to overlay it at the level of regulation, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense.
Yeah, and I think that at least one thing that we've done recently, again, it's taken me about 2 years to fully rest, to get back to being the primary influence in the organization's life, so to speak. But one of the things that I feel a real sense of personal responsibility on, and actually I think this by itself could be an interesting point to chew on, is that like, I feel like it's actually absurd to expect anyone in an organization to take great care of the organization if it's not taking great care of them at the level of endeavoring to transparently and clearly be the best opportunity for that person's investment of time in their work. And what I mean is, like, I want it to be true at my organization that every single person at the organization has an opportunity to reach a level of success through their career with me that would essentially be making their dreams come true, not just mine. And I think most organizations are constructed kind of like the military, where there's like a certain relatively large percentage of the troops that are viewed somewhat as like collateral damage material, that like, hey, in order to produce
disposable.
in order to produce the widget or whatever the output of this organization is, there just have to be some people in roles that are not terribly glamorous and or are not putting them on a track to what they want to be true in their life. Like, every building needs a janitor, so to speak.
Yep.
And in our organization, it may be true that every building needs a janitor. We're not a physical organization, so we don't have a janitor. But even if we did, I would want that janitor to be able to go home and tell his or her spouse, you know what? Even though I'm the janitor at this organization, that is still a path to the life of our dreams. Otherwise, how can I even remotely expect them to take care of the organization?
100%. So I completely agree with you. And I think alignment around the vision and purpose helps a lot, so that people see how they contribute. You use the janitor example, but there actually is that real janitor example of JFK, right? President Kennedy going to NASA and asking someone who was doing a menial job, so what do you do? And the answer was, I helped to put men on the moon, right? I mean, it's that kind of such a good story, right? The thing I would add, though, Jeff, is that sometimes too, it's about recognizing when people have to move beyond your organization, not because they've done anything wrong, but because you can't, in the end, give them the next step of personal development, of fulfillment that they have. And I've personally gone through this with a few people in my org who are just tremendous people and hugely valued by the organization and doing interesting work. But just because of the nature of who we are, I wouldn't say outgrew us, but they needed something more different, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we're a tremendous employer, right? So, and I think people across the board would say that they really enjoy working with us. And I think we've got a really great cohesive team, but there's also, I think, wisdom in recognizing when, and not getting into the dynamic of trying to hold on to people just because they're valuable for your organization, because I don't think that serves anybody either. Does that make sense to you?
Very much. And certainly I would agree with that. And obviously, as we've downsized the organization, there've been a lot of people. I think that the vision for me is just that, like, our organization is always a part of some sort of upward propulsion for them, whether it's here or outward to somewhere else.
There you go. That's it.
I do align with that. I think I visualize, again, I will admit my own ignorance. I have sort of a presumptuous view of how other organizations run based on the amount of therapy that I've had to do with people that used to work at other organizations and brought their stuff here, and trying to help them embrace love-based leadership, and realizing the amount of like trauma that I was trying to help them overcome, and the amount of fear that they had in even accepting or believing that an organization could be love-based. I mean, it's like the proverbial foster kid that comes from an abused home and is always, essentially keeps acting as if they're in an abusive home when they're not anymore, right? That was like every employee, not every, but that was like many employees that came to work for us. They were like abused foster kids. And,
Yep.
And so I do wonder, I mean, well, maybe two questions I'll ask you, because you have a lot more experience with other larger organizations than I do. First of all, is it actually as bad elsewhere as I'm suggesting it seems to be, particularly at larger organizations? And
yes.
Secondly, it is.
Yeah, it is. Well, and for reasons that you would expect it to be, Jeff, that you've already identified, right? Which is that when you are on a quarterly cycle, right? When you are being pushed to achieve short-term returns, and when that is driving you to make what you know to be bad long-term decisions, it's corrosive, right? And I think that, and it's why, I think that, I can't go off the record here, but I'll go carefully on the record. Conventional, shareholder capitalism, it's the least, in the end, I think, efficient and effective form of organization, right? Now, I think that good leaders in those organizations do their best to balance the short term and the long term. They do their best to balance being good to people, but also delivering results. But they're under nearly relentless pressure to do that, right? Whereas if you have privately held companies or family-owned companies, right, or VC, private equity-owned companies, it's not that you're not any less rigorous at all. It's just that you have a longer-term view of what you're there to do, right? And you're able to make decisions that actually make sense for the longer term. To me, it's tragic when you see great organizations being hollowed out by short-term thinking, right? They're literally selling the assets of the organization, right? They're winding down and extracting value in a way that is eventually going to lead to, if not a collapse, a really significant, diminution of the organization, and maybe then it goes into turnaround and something good happens, right? And I see that these days too often, right? I see it too often that I feel like they're kind of mortgaging the future to deliver these results in the now.
Hey there, it's Jeff. So real quick, I want to let you know about my text message community. I use text messages to provide unique value to the Unlock Your Potential community. These texts could just be random thoughts. It could be letting you be the first to know about an event I'm planning, maybe giving an update on a special I'm running or some free training that I host for my community. Anyway, just shoot me a text to get subscribed to the list. The number is 702-996-3926. Again, that is 702-996-3926. Let's get back to the podcast. So you mentioned shareholder capitalism. So, I'm sure for the audience, if they don't, that in the early 70s, Milton Friedman wrote this article that basically argued that the point of a for-profit business is to produce profits for the shareholders. And that, for the last now 50, I guess that was 52 years ago, I think, corporate America has essentially glommed onto that idea and used it to justify basically the way business is now. And then there's this sort of stakeholder capitalism counterpoint, almost, rebellion happening. Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum seems to be a figurehead of it, basically saying, no, we need to get back to, although I will say I've had multiple viewpoints about his particular role, and, I don't know. Yep. I'm just the messenger, yep. But yeah, so that's the context. I do sometimes wonder, and stakeholder capitalism basically says, no, it's not just about shareholders. Shareholders are but one critical stakeholder. It's about the employees, the vendors, the customers, the shareholders, the management, and everybody. It's about everybody winning, and that the goal is to optimize the win-win nature of the thing versus just the one group winning. I'm curious, do you have a stance on that fundamental question that maybe very much does tie into what we're talking about?
Yeah, I guess I do. At the risk of having many people pile all over me for my viewpoint, right? But I like to think in terms of sustainability in the broader sense. I don't mean in the narrow sense we're talking about these days, but in the broader sense. The broader sense of, is what we're doing going to create a place where your grandchildren and my grandchildren and their grandchildren are going to want to live, And I don't think so these days, right? I don't think that balance exists today, and it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist today in part because of exactly the kind of classical economics that Milton Friedman would have, espoused, right? Because we've got externalities, right? We're externalizing a lot of the damage, right, outside the boundaries of those corporations that, yes, maybe arguably work most efficiently when they're there as agents, to, as Friedman would have talked, to kind of benefit the principals in that sense of the shareholders, right? So that whole notion of, I'll be a little more precise. I would be happy with the system if it actually internalized everything that should be internalized to make long-term sustainability for our societies and our planets a reality. then go for it, right? Because then the system is optimizing. And I mean, my PhD was in decision theory and game theory, right? I mean, yeah. So I mean, this is.
So I insulted you when I asked if you knew about the prisoner's dilemma.
You didn't insult me, but I smiled. Let's put it that way, right? So, and actually, the chapter in the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking that's about mental agility has a bunch of stuff about game theory in it. Yeah, but does what I'm saying make sense, Jeff?
Yeah,
it's
no. Yeah. I mean, we align with it. I'm almost like maybe at a little more utopian extreme of like, well, I'm just gonna buy my little 100-acre island and build my love-based leadership utopia over here, and dream that it could be so everywhere else too, and maybe I'll throw stones from my island at the passing ships. But like, am I really in the game trying to make it happen? Like, I'm not a consultant. I'm not soliciting any Fortune 500 companies right now to come, advise them on installing love-based leadership. Maybe I should put my money where my mouth is in that sense. But I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm looking for here, is to try to assess almost my own level of naivete, or the futility or not there of envisioning that like we could actually affect this kind of change in the larger organizations that really define corporate culture, because otherwise, I actually kind of long for a world where all the big companies fail and we just fragment into a lot of solopreneur endeavors that are sort of AI supported, where everybody can create a culture that they'd want their grandkids to be a part of, because apparently it's hopeless to, expect the bigger companies to do anything about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's super important not to end up in a state of cynicism or despair about this, right? And I think that going out there and fighting the good fight for what you believe in with these things and building what you can, that's the antidote to me to, what otherwise would be a kind of a bit of a dark experience, right? But the other thing too is I think that continuing to develop the ideas, Jeff, in a way that people can digest them and really, work with them, and is, I think, crucial, right? I think we did some of that today when we talked about, well, what would have to be true about your hiring process, right? What would have to be true about your decision-making and performance management systems, right? You could get pretty concrete about it. And then hopefully you're going to find this mildly entertaining, but I actually created the Love-Based Leadership Manifesto. Now, manifesto is a funny word, right? So you got to be careful with these words, right? I'm not talking the communist manifesto. But I'm
actually, for the record, I'm reading the Capitalist Manifesto right now by Robert Kiyosaki.
Yeah.
They're not all communist manifestos.
There you go. So just for fun, right? Here's the 10 basic principles of love-based leadership. And I think, people will understand this. People will resonate to this. Now, this is not yours. You've got to create your own version of this, because this is your thing, right? But I think it's just, and again, you won't be surprised, but I use one of my AI tools to do this, right? To create this initial draft. I didn't write that myself, right? But I inputted a whole lot about your principles, your theory, your approach to doing things. And I just said, okay, generate for me a 10-principle love-based leadership manifesto.
So I'll say for the audience that and Michael, I'll ask you if you could copy paste this and send it to me so we can actually put it in the notes for people to listen and want to reference. This is very cool. I'm looking at it. And I think that, so it's interesting. You mentioned AI, and I've had this little thought in the back of my mind the whole time we've been talking, that perhaps there's an opportunity to link this back to something we talked about in our previous conversation, where you were talking about the different levels of human function that are sort of sequentially getting usurped by machines.
Yep, exactly.
And I think there were, I don't remember how many you had. Was it 7 or 5?
7. Yep.
7.
Good memory. 7. Yep. Good memory.
And our sort of a premise of our last conversation was that as machines take over this list of human functions from the bottom up, from the least sophisticated to the most sophisticated, the kind of lower order functioning of humans becomes more and more less and less human. It's, machines are taking that over. So there's actually no value. I mean, there used to be a value in a human being's ability to cook a French fry. Soon the day will come when there is absolutely no value in a human being's ability to cook a French fry, because all French fries will be cooked by a machine, because that's not a very sophisticated function. And that what'll be left, as this continues to happen, what's left is at the top. It's like, I forget, maybe I'll let you say, like, what were the top 2 or 3 that were the most human?
No, it's those deeper emotional and creative capabilities, right? It's exactly in line with what you're talking about, right? I mean, the worry, of course, is, what's it going to do to employment in general, right? But I think that there's real potential for a substantial upgrading of what people do, because AI takes care of a bunch of the credit,
Right.
So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
So I'm sort of trying to connect that to the love-based leadership concept to say, right now, there's probably a certain amount of warranted cynicism to say, look, it can't be all love-based all the time for all people in all organizations, because sometimes the work sucks, and sometimes people lack the skills to not have the work suck, even if the work didn't have to suck because it wasn't intrinsically sucky work. But like, is there a point where the machines have consumed enough of the lower order functions that what's left is that really the only place left in the workforce are for people that are compassionate and creative and humane, and that, that would actually be awesome. And frankly, everybody that doesn't want to play that way can just sit at home and be taken care of by machines in some sort of like, not universal basic income, but like universal basic sustenance, and let those of us that want to build love-based organizations actually do the freaking work, and everybody else go home. No,
I love it, Jeff. And what's so interesting is we tend to end up in really interesting places, right? But if we've got a few minutes, and I want to just seed one idea to you and suggest somebody that you might want to talk to, who I think you could have a quite remarkable conversation with. The person I'm talking about is a guy named Nicholas Shiati. He wrote a wonderful book that received a few awards last year called "The Leader is Healer." And I think that there's
that on our last episode, but we weren't able to dig into it. Okay.
No. So I think that I know there's both overlap and difference, but I think it would be fascinating for you to explore that with him, both the overlap and the difference, right? I mean, I think he goes more deeply into the trauma healing side of things, probably that love-based leadership does or would. But I just think you'd have an incredible conversation.
I will say, we actually probably do go where he goes. We're just not necessarily saying that's necessarily a part of love-based leadership. We just happen to have a lot of work, experience and interest in
but you've just launched what I know is going to be a great conversation.
Oh, I'm super excited to hear it. And I actually think that it comes down to sort of almost like a moral imperative around leadership. Is like,
100%.
Should we even entertain? I don't know. I tend to avoid shoulds, and I tend to avoid things that lead to a lack of tolerance. So maybe I'm already trapped. But like, I think there are a lot of ego-based motivations embedded in leadership theory. And to me, leader as healer is one sort of subset of leader as servant. And obviously there's a lot of talk about servant leadership. And I actually somewhat subscribe to the idea that, I don't know how to say this. It's almost like what we're really battling against is the fact that people that naturally rise to the level of leadership in competitive organizations are typically people with what I think some would call maybe like dark personality traits that allow them to win those games. Yeah. And they're not inherently service oriented at all. That's not what got them into that seat. And so I don't know, man. I think you're
really onto something. No, you're really onto something with this, right? I do think that conventional organizations, sadly, tend to attract and advance dark personalities more than others too, right?
What
I actually I wrote a piece about this recently, actually.
Okay.
So, because after
send us the link. I'd love to promote it
for sure.
in our link, because this is the stuff that I'm really actually interested in. You know, I mean, the market probably has certain expectations of what my podcast and my work will be about. It's kind of the same conversation. I don't want to do things for the reasons that everybody expects or everybody does things. Like, if we're not making the world better, how have we even earned the oxygen that we're breathing?
100%.
Like, survival is not a noble aim. I just want to declare, like, surviving is not a noble aim if it's at the expense of others.
No, and you could argue that that's true as a species and not just as individuals, right? What is it, why is it that we should survive as a species? And it can't be just because we exist, right? I mean, it's profound issues you're talking about, right? And I've super enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have too. It's been, and I'll introduce you to Nicholas and say, you guys got to talk, and hopefully you'll end up having a great conversation. And maybe at some point we can have another conversation, because I think it's super, super interesting to talk.
Yeah, I think my takeaway from this, Michael, and I want to say thank you for this. And I know we're out of time, and I want to let you go. I just want to say thank you, because I think talking about these ideas, it's one thing for me to talk about these ideas in a room where I'm sort of the presumed and perceived authority on the matter and people are eager to learn. I feel like in talking about these ideas with you, it's forcing me to say, okay, you said that my takeaway is there's a need for rigor. You said that multiple times. That if this is going to have traction outside of domains that I have a lot of influence over, it's got to be like highly, almost like process oriented and standardized.
I agree with that. And you have to write the book.
And I got to write the book. Yeah, you said that last time too. So, hey, Michael, I'm that flew by. I'm actually sort of like,
yeah. No, it's super interesting. Really, I really appreciate the conversation. It's rare I get to have conversations with this kind of depth to them, and I really enjoy it a lot. And I've got a transcript from an AI system. I think you're gonna find super interesting, right? The final piece of which is the manifesto, right? But I'll send it to you.
Amazing. Okay, well, thank you. I'll let you go, but I want to give you a proper forum here. Anything you'd like to say to the audience? Draw them into your world. Tell them about what you do, or this is your moment.
All we really need is love.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Michael.
Amen. Listen, but seriously, right? More than ever, we need reasons to hope, and we need reasons to feel energized, and we need to connect with each other, right? More than ever, for what we're going through, what we're going to go through. So I commend the work you're doing, without reservation, and thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, Michael. You and I will stay in touch, and audience, hopefully you'll get to meet Michael again soon. If not, go find him on other podcasts. He's amazing.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
Artificial intelligence in all its incarnations may be the single biggest event in the history of our species. What we're seeing is an increasing erosion of what makes human beings unique.